Merci à tout le monde ici à IFAS et surtout à tous ceux qui ont beaucoup travaillé afin que je sois ici aujourd'hui. Surtout Adrien et Victor et Camille. Je ne sais pas où elle est.
Camille.
Ah, voilà. Okay. So, Africanizing Apartheid, White South Africa and the quest for post-colonial legitimacy. So our story starts on the 25th of August 1975, specific day, and the heavy-set figure of John Foster, the Prime Minister of Apartheid South Africa, steps out of his car and into the African sunlight. Victoria Falls is roaring to his left. Ahead, there's a 5-carriage train provided by his government, and it sits on the bridge perilously constructed over the roaring Zambezi River below. Foster had come to the very border between white-ruled and black-ruled Africa, and as he approached the train, he warmly greeted Zambia's president, Kenneth Kaunda, who had come from the other side of the bridge. Together they entered the main carriage, determined to broker a settlement which they hoped would lead to an end of white rule in Rhodesia. Now this was obviously a very unlikely scene, and one which captivated the world's press. Kaunda was of course one of the world's foremost critics of apartheid on the global stage. Just a few years before, he had declared, "The philosophy of apartheid denies to the black people the right to be. It forces them to conform to an image which the so-called master race has created of them to prove black inferiority and white superiority." But how times had changed. Now, Kaunda told the world that of all peoples, John Foster's was, quote, "the voice of reason," for which Africa and the rest of the world had been waiting. So what on earth was going on? Why did John Foster reach out to black Africa at the same time as his government brutally oppressed black South Africans at home? Why was one of black Africa's most ardent critics of apartheid so keen to work with the regime in Pretoria? And thinking more broadly, what did this counterintuitive meeting say about the changing nature of the whole post-war world right across the global south, as the heady optimism of the post-colonial 1960s gave way to the chaotic pessimism of the 1970s? Now the answers to these questions lie at the heart of understanding the destructive dynamics of the Cold War in Africa, the chaotic final phase of decolonization, the emerging role of race as a central concern in global affairs, and ultimately the decline and fall of the apartheid regime itself. And my book manuscript, which I'm just finishing up at the moment, and from which this talk is drawn, explains how the leaders of white South Africa sought to preserve apartheid, with a focus on this geopolitical crisis of the mid-1970s. In 1974, few observers within or outside South Africa believed that a confrontation with apartheid could force real change. The regime simply appeared too stable, too strong. By 1976, that was completely different. That confrontation was a reality, and it was intensifying by the month. Portugal had abandoned its southern African colonies, first in Mozambique and then chaotically in Angola. African nationalism was on the march, and Cold War powers were starting to directly involve themselves in the region for their own geopolitical and ideological interests. So my project, in this synthesis of intellectual, diplomatic and political history, I try to situate South Africa's search for security in the context of what is an ongoing quest for identity, for legitimacy, and for acceptance in an unstable post-colonial world, as white supremacist leaders sought to identify new geopolitical and intellectual frameworks that would help them re-legitimize their existing racial hierarchies. And in doing so, I make 3 core arguments. First, I argue that there was never any serious effort on the part of Pretoria to fundamentally alter apartheid in line with emerging post-colonial norms on non-racialist governance. Instead, the regime sought to do something quite different. It sought to exploit international cleavages that actually cut across anti-apartheid sentiments and thereby gain limited forms of support and legitimacy for its internal order. Second, for John Foster specifically, and this is why I focus on him, this meant a recalibration of how apartheid was fundamentally understood, both at home and and abroad, through a recalibration, a shift in how white South Africa engaged, or was seen to engage, with black Africa. Finally, there was extensive opposition to this strategy of Foster's, both among his colleagues and in the white electorate as a whole. The debate over what counted as a legitimate state in the global south was hotly contested, but not only between black and white in South Africa and black and white in Africa as a whole, but also within white South Africa itself. The contours of this multifaceted concept over what a legitimate state was and whether apartheid could ever be one it reveals a great deal about the changing notions of legitimacy, questions of ideology, and programs of state building, not only in South Africa, but right across the developing world. So today I'm going to do three things. First of all, I'm going to talk very briefly about how historians have studied the apartheid regime and how we can use this productively or go in new directions and find new answers. Second, I'm going to talk in detail about one important part of this story, why Foster reached out to black Africa and why his African outreach ultimately failed. And third, I'm going to try and connect it to the big picture. I'm going to talk about the implications of this reinterpretation of apartheid's place in the world for our understanding of central themes of post-war history, connecting the story to bigger questions of African, Cold War, and decolonization history. So first of all, historiography. In understanding how South Africa dealt with this crisis that began in the mid-1970s, the existing literature has tended to reflect three positions. First of all, historians have typically seen Portugal's withdrawal from the colonies in Angola and Mozambique in 1974-75, and the resulting reopening of questions about the region's future as essentially the beginning of the end for Pretoria, a moment when the stalled teleology of decolonization restarted, leading to the fall of the regime exactly 20 years later. This is misguided. Events in the region plainly heralded a turning point. But where history turned towards was an open question, and it was one which Foster and his allies were both eager and able to influence. Second, historians have described South Africa's efforts to deal with this crisis as driven by a fundamental incompatibility between Pretoria's racial principles and those of its critics. This is partly true, but this conventional wisdom misrepresents the complex and often counterintuitive ways in which ideas of race inform South African leaders' understandings of the vectors of change in the post-colonial era. It also, crucially, neglects the diversity of their viewpoints. It presupposes that all white South Africans understood the role of race in their social order, both in a day-to-day and in a bigger geopolitical sense, similarly, essentially as the mirror image to Western sensibilities. It also presupposes that their views didn't change over time. Both of these presuppositions are inaccurate. Finally, historians have tended to see Pretoria's conduct as overwhelmingly reactive to external events. Instead, as we'll see today, South Africa's actions during this 1970s What was Foster's strategy? In an effort to establish a foundation for coexistence between white South Africa and African nationalism on an ideological level, not a day-to-day level, Foster and his associates looked to black Africa through their outward policy. Now, in the post-colonial era, black Africa had a deep abhorrence of a system of government that was deeply redolent of the racism and exploitation they associated with their own experiences of colonialism. But crucially, by the late 1960s, the existing Pan-African responses to apartheid, blanket hostility, economic boycott.
We had maybe a month ago a seminar on the Franco-South African relations, diplomatic relations, in more or less the same period, in the second half of the 20th century, by Anna Konieczna, not wrong. We had a wonderful seminar a couple of weeks ago about the relation between the apartheid regime and the Portuguese Empire, also in the 20th century, by Caio Simões. And we will have on the 16th of October a very interesting seminar also by Pape Ndiaye, a French scholar who is a specialist of the US and who is now working on the references made in the US to the apartheid regime, also the same period, how much the civil rights movement were doing references to the apartheid reality. So your seminar, Jamie, is fitting very well in this series. Jamie Miller is presently at Cornell doing a postdoc. He finalized and defended his PhD last year, at Cambridge, and we are very glad to finally found your way here to the French Institute. This is wonderful. Jamie will present a paper called the Africanising Apartheid, White South Africa, and the question. The quest for post-colonial legitimacy. Then we have 40-45 minutes, even more if you want.
And then we'll do some questions.
And then we will go for questions.
Okay.
Thanks.
Voilà. Merci à tout le monde ici à IFAS et surtout à tous ceux qui ont beaucoup travaillé afin que je sois ici aujourd'hui. Surtout Adrien et Victor et Camille. Je ne sais pas où on est là.
Camille.
Ah, voilà. Okay. So, Africanizing Apartheid, White South Africa, and the quest for post-colonial legitimacy. So our story starts on the 25th of August, 1975, specific day, when the heavy-set figure of John Foster, the Prime Minister of Apartheid South Africa, steps out of his car and into the African sunlight. Victoria Falls is roaring to his left. Ahead, there's a 5-carriage train provided by his government, and it sits on the bridge perilously constructed over the roaring Zambezi River below. Foster had come to the very border between white-ruled and black-ruled Africa, and as he approached the train, he warmly greeted Zambia's president, Kenneth Kaunda, who had come from the other side of the bridge. Together they entered the main carriage, determined to broker a settlement which they hoped would lead to an end of white rule in Rhodesia. Now this was obviously a very unlikely scene, and one which captivated the world's press. Kaunda was of course one of the world's foremost critics of apartheid on the global stage. Just a few years before, he had declared, "The philosophy of apartheid denies to the black people the right to be. It forces them to conform to an image which the so-called master race has created of them to prove black inferiority and white superiority." But how times had changed. Now, Kaunda told the world that of all peoples, John Foster's was, quote, "the voice of reason," for which Africa and the rest of the world had been waiting. So what on earth was going on? Why did John Foster reach out to black Africa at the same time as his government brutally oppressed black South Africans at home? Why was one of black Africa's most ardent critics of apartheid so keen to work with the regime in Pretoria? And thinking more broadly, what did this counterintuitive meaning say about the changing nature of the whole post-war world right across the global south, as the heady optimism of the post-colonial 1960s gave way to the chaotic pessimism of the 1970s? Now, the answers to these questions lie at the heart of understanding the destructive dynamics of the Cold War in Africa, the chaotic final phase of decolonization, the emerging role of race as a central concern in global affairs, and ultimately the decline and fall of the apartheid regime itself. And my book manuscript, which I'm just finishing up at the moment, and from which this talk is drawn, explains how the leaders of white South Africa sought to preserve apartheid, with a focus on this geopolitical crisis of the mid-1970s. In 1974, few observers within or outside South Africa believed that a confrontation with apartheid could force real change. The regime simply appeared too stable, too strong. By 1976, that was completely different. That confrontation was a reality, and it was intensifying by the month. Portugal had abandoned its southern African colonies, first in Mozambique and then chaotically in Angola. African nationalism was on the march, and Cold War powers were starting to directly involve themselves in the region for their own geopolitical and ideological interests. So my project, in this synthesis of intellectual, diplomatic and political history, I try to situate South Africa's search for security in the context of what is an ongoing quest for identity, for legitimacy, and for acceptance in an unstable post-colonial world, as white supremacist leaders sought to identify new geopolitical and intellectual frameworks that would help them re-legitimize their existing racial hierarchies. And in doing so, I make three core arguments. First, I argue that there was never any serious effort on the part of Pretoria to fundamentally alter apartheid in line with emerging post-colonial norms on non-racialist governance. Instead, the regime sought to do something quite different. It sought to exploit international cleavages that actually cut across anti-apartheid sentiments and thereby gain limited forms of support and legitimacy for its internal order. Second, for John Foster specifically, and this is why I focus on him, this meant a recalibration of how apartheid was fundamentally understood, both at home and and abroad, through a recalibration, a shift in how white South Africa engaged, or was seen to engage, with black Africa. Finally, there was extensive opposition to this strategy of Foster's, both among his colleagues and in the white electorate as a whole. The debate over what counted as a legitimate state in the global south was hotly contested, but not only between black and white in South Africa and black and white in Africa as a whole, but also within white South Africa itself. The contours of this multifaceted concept over what a legitimate state was and whether apartheid could ever be one it reveals a great deal about the changing notions of legitimacy, questions of ideology, and programs of state building, not only in South Africa, but right across the developing world. So today I'm going to do three things. First of all, I'm going to talk very briefly about how historians have studied the apartheid regime and how we can use this productively or go in new directions and find new answers. Second, I'm going to talk in detail about one important part of this story, why Foster reached out to black Africa and why his African outreach ultimately failed. And third, I'm going to try and connect it to the big picture. I'm going to talk about the implications of this reinterpretation of apartheid's place in the world for our understanding of central themes of post-war history, connecting the story to bigger questions of African, Cold War and decolonization history. So first of all, historiography. In understanding how South Africa dealt with this crisis that began in the mid-1970s, the existing literature has tended to reflect three positions. First of all, historians have typically seen Portugal's withdrawal from the colonies in Angola and Mozambique in 1974-75, and the resulting reopening of questions about the region's future as essentially the beginning of the end for Pretoria, a moment when the stalled teleology of decolonization restarted, leading to the fall of the regime exactly 20 years later. This is misguided. Events in the region plainly heralded a turning point. But where history turned towards was an open question, and it was one which Foster and his allies were both eager and able to influence. Second, historians have described South Africa's efforts to deal with this crisis as driven by a fundamental incompatibility between Pretoria's racial principles and those of its critics. This is partly true, but this conventional wisdom misrepresents the complex and often counterintuitive ways in which ideas of race inform South African leaders' understandings of the vectors of change in the post-colonial era. It also, crucially, neglects the diversity of their viewpoints. It presupposes that all white South Africans understood the role of race in their social order, both in a day-to-day and in a bigger geopolitical sense, similarly, essentially as the mirror image to Western sensibilities. It also presupposes that their views didn't change over time. Both of these presuppositions are inaccurate. Finally, historians have tended to see Pretoria's conduct as overwhelmingly reactive to external events. Instead, as we'll see today, South Africa's actions during this 1974 to 76 window reflected a pre-existing, much broader and often very heated contest in the corridors of power over how apartheid related to the modern world, and a contest that unfolded on the levels of politics, philosophy, and political philosophy. Policy, personalities, and political philosophy. Sorry. Now, in order to understand how the architects of apartheid understood their system, I turn to their own words. This study is grounded heavily in materials from the South African State Archives, in both Afrikaans and English, Little Red Afrikaans memoirs, as well as about 50 hours of interviews I conducted with officials from the former regime, politicians, diplomats, generals, intelligence agents, and so on. And I also contextualize this using an international dimension. I use Zimbabwean, French, British, and American archives as well. So, to the second part of the book. In focus. Sorry. Why did John Foster reach out to Black Africa? Why was this policy so successful in the short term? Why was he meeting with Kenneth Kaunda on the Victoria Falls Bridge? And then why, within such a short space of time, did the policy fail? The context here is critical. By the end of the Second World War, South Africa's society was exceptionally diverse. We know there were white Anglophones and Afrikaners. There were Indians and Malays who had been imported to work on plantations, and there were various groups of Africans. The society and the economy had been shaped by decades, even centuries, of segregation and ad hoc racial discrimination. And in 1948, the Afrikaner National Party, of course, came to power on a platform of extending and formalizing this systemic racism in the name of the separate development of each community, or, as we know, in the Afrikaans term, apartheid. And by the start of the Foster era in 1966, when he succeeds Hendrik Verwoerd, it was accepted as shibboleth that black Africans would only be permitted to express political rights through ethnic homelands based on the old colonial native reserves, seen here on the map, while simultaneously being denied basic day-to-day equality in shared areas and in the public sphere. Now, Pretoria during this period validated apartheid through what were essentially neo-colonial norms and discourses, not far removed from the 3 C's of the scramble for Africa: Christianity, free commerce, and civilization. The regime saw its legitimacy as intrinsically linked to its relationships to Western states. But from the mid-1950s, the old colonial order in Africa began to quickly disintegrate. The array of fledgling states that emerged in its place identified South Africa's apartheid system with its entrenched racialism as the very symbolic antithesis of the emergent vision of what it meant to be a post-colonial global South state. Now, unlike his predecessors, John Foster realized this. He realized that the old framework of norms, values, and institutions that sustained the South African regime, both domestically and abroad, was losing currency fast. So he therefore sought new scaffoldings of legitimacy for the apartheid order by embarking upon a most unexpected campaign to corrode the identification of his regime as the last vestige of European colonialism, and instead redefine the white polity as an African and post-colonial entity. In other words, unwilling to change what apartheid was on the ground, oppressive, violent, brutal. He instead resolved to change what apartheid meant by embedding it in a new set of values and norms. Foster's goal, in other words, was to conceptually reshape apartheid around norms of interdependence and coexistence, rather than dominance and hierarchy. "We are, in every respect, a part of Africa," he declared just months after taking office. The watchword of his regime, of his speeches, became coexistence of white and black on an equal footing, both inside the Republic's borders, between the whites and the black homelands, and on the African continent as a whole. "If nationalism was right for my people, then it is right for anyone, irrespective of his colour," Foster announced in 1971. In short, if the foundations of this hostile post-colonial world were anti-colonialism, were a rejection of racial hierarchies and national self-determination, then Foster resolved to appropriate these very principles, adapt and twist them to the existing apartheid order, and use the new constructs to justify white independence, viability and security in Africa. What was Foster's strategy? In an effort to establish a foundation for coexistence between white South Africa and African nationalism on an ideological level, not a day-to-day level, Foster and his associates looked to black Africa through their outward policy. Now, in the post-colonial era, black Africa had a deep abhorrence of a system of government that was deeply redolent of the racism and exploitation they associated with their own experiences of colonialism. But crucially, by the late 1960s, the existing Pan-African responses to apartheid, blanket hostility, economic boycott, and support for liberation movements was proving deeply ineffective. This context is critical. In 1969, only 4 African states paid their dues to the OAU's Liberation Committee. But the idea had entirely run out of steam. So Foster and his allies therefore decided the following. First, if South Africa offered to help black Africa achieve its goals, both political, economic and developmental, then self-interest would lead these states to embrace cooperation rather than engage in a pattern of confrontation that had become essentially futile. Second, through trade and diplomacy, they believed that the South African government could drive a wedge between radical communist states which demanded the destruction of the Pretoria regime and moderate anti-communist ones, which while still opposed to apartheid, did not. Third, with African militancy quelled and divided, they believed that South Africa would have the time and space to illustrate the validity of separate development as a mechanism for African self-determination. Now, but so many moderate African leaders were willing to enter into bilateral relations of one kind or another with the apartheid state on this basis is fascinating enough. But let's go deeper. How is South Africa trying to reshape the debate over legitimacy itself in the global South? What about if we think about it on an intellectual level, not just a geopolitical level? If we try to look at it in 3 dimensions. Now, the outward policy essentially attempted to replace African leaders' support for a vision of decolonization that allowed for no apartheid whatsoever, with 2 alternate visions for post-colonial Africa. One, in which apartheid was essentially accepted as a legitimate means of facilitating the separate development of different ethnic communities in South Africa. And another, in which the Cold War, rather than racial concerns, became the dominant paradigm for African politics. To the first. So Pretoria endeavoured to present apartheid as fully compatible with decolonisation. Pretoria's new willingness to engage with black Africa, on the one hand in the continent, was essentially presented as proof of its bona fides regarding genuine self-determination at home for the homelands in South Africa. And as Pretoria began to accelerate the development and investment in the homelands in South Africa in the early 1970s, it increasingly expressed its program for cohabitation alongside other ethnic groups on the exact same basis as its desired coexistence with the post-colonial African states to its north. In 1971, Foster said outright, "We have too long described ourselves as Europeans to the outside world. We are not Europeans. We are of Africa. We were born here in Africa and we will die here in Africa." And Foster duly signalled a shift away from the vertical oppressive racism of the past. Quote, under no circumstances should you slight a person who speaks a different language, whose skin is a different colour, who has a different standard of civilization. You must never adopt the attitude that you are better than another person, he declared in 1970. The next year, he went even further. If your policy is founded on your being better than someone else because you have a white skin, it is wrong, foolish, and vain. Who are you but a creature of God, as he is, to raise yourself and think you are better than he? Now, as should be apparent, these were absolutely radical statements in the context of the racial policies of the ruling National Party and the racial mores of the white electorate. However, the attempt to make apartheid appear less hierarchical and more compatible with decolonization, that specific idea, met with little success in black Africa. Pretoria's long-standing support for various colonial powers, the impact, visibly and obvious, of apartheid on black South African social, political and economic opportunities, as well as South Africa's sub-imperial domination of the entire region, really substantially undercut this claim to a sui generis form of benevolent multi-ethnic federalism. Domestic legislation to give real force to Foster's public and declared rejection of day-to-day discrimination really never appeared en masse. It was only ever piecemeal and hesitant. Right into the 1980s, it was still illegal to marry or have sex across the colour line, for example, though both practices were, in fact, fairly widespread. Where Pretoria enjoyed more success was with this vision, one in which states prioritised a shared commitment to anti-communism rather than focusing on racial equality, which to us today seems completely counterintuitive. Pretoria realised very quickly, as it started reaching out to black Africa, that moderate African states were far more receptive to its overtures than the radical ones, whose ideologies dictated a more militant brand of anti-apartheid and anti-colonialist sentiment. It also realised, crucially, that by constructing relationships with the moderate states, it could help deepen that cleavage between the two types, undermining the international perception of a united Pan-African front against South Africa. Otherwise phrased, South Africa sought not merely to take advantage of African regimes' Cold War loyalties, but to strengthen those identifications and thereby reshape the ideological contours of post-colonial African politics. And in doing so, it enjoyed successes that were short-lived, but nevertheless nothing short of remarkable in the context of Africa's antipathy towards apartheid. Here's Kaunda on the right, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania on the left. In 1969, 14 Eastern and Southern African leaders, including Kaunda and Nyerere at the front, signed on to the Lusaka Manifesto. The manifesto qualified their previous unrelenting support of armed struggle to overthrow apartheid. At a major press conference in 1971, the man in the middle, Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast, and obviously a central figure in Francophone Africa, counselled dialogue with the Republic, quote, on an equal footing, and even referred to apartheid as, quote, a matter within the domestic jurisdiction of South Africa, i.e., not a concern for other African states. By 1974, the archival research up in Pretoria shows very clearly that South Africa talked and traded not just with the usual characters, white-ruled Rhodesia, Angola, Mozambique, but with almost all anti-communist states in Africa, and even some radical ones as well. You can see this very clearly here on the map. They're all the states South Africa was trading with on a regular basis by 1974. So the outward policy had some real success to it, much more than we could possibly ever imagine, though never quite as many successes as Foster and his supporters hoped. But what it did mean was that when the Portuguese regime fell in 1974, provoking the regional crisis I talked about at the very beginning of the talk, there was massive momentum inside Pretoria, in the union building, for the idea that engagement with black Africa, rather than confrontation, was the way forward. This was why Kaunda and Foster ended up at Victoria Falls together. The outside world still saw South Africa and Rhodesia as pillars of the white redoubt, an axis of states working together to preserve racist hegemony in the region. But if we look at the Rhodesian archives from this time, which have since been repatriated up to Harare, so I don't know if anyone's going to be able to see them very soon, John Foster was already moving away from this vision. The archives show very clearly in the early 1970s that he repeatedly refused increased Rhodesian requests for military and diplomatic assistance. His successes in Black Africa were pivotal. They were a Saul on the road to Damascus moment for him. They convinced him that long-term stability and security was not to be sought through collaboration with white regimes, but rather through cooperation with anti-communist ones, regardless of colour. Consequently, as the regional atmosphere transitioned from stasis to flux in 1974, Foster took a deeply unpopular decision. He resolved to ride the wave of re-energised African nationalism and work with Black Africa to broker a settlement in Rhodesia. To do that, he had to reach out to Kenneth Kaunda to show that instead of embodying the problem of white racism, South Africa somehow could be an indispensable part of the solution. So why did it fail? This is a fascinating question. It's evidently not because Black Africa was unreceptive to Foster's new visions for Africa's future. Kaunda would not have turned up to Victoria Falls, handing Foster the most amazing public relations coup if he thought he was being used. Instead, the problem was that outside Foster's inner circle, very few power brokers in Pretoria were fully supportive of the idea that South Africa could make the conceptual shifts of identity that the Prime Minister was signalling. And on closer examination, this opposition actually consisted of two separate critiques. The first came from the Hawks in South Africa's military establishment, led by Defence Minister, later Prime Minister, later President, P.W. Gordon. The Hawks believed that the anti-apartheid hostility of African nationalism was merely a facade for a communist onslaught aimed at the riches and strategic position of South Africa. To them, crucially, the communist drive for hegemony was an ideological imperative. So, any notion that it could be incentivized through negotiation or trade or diplomacy, all the things Foster believed very deeply in, was wishful thinking. And the records show Botha repeatedly, assertively, even aggressively, counselling his unreceptive Prime Minister that instead of trying to marginalise these radical movements through uncertain processes of negotiation diplomacy, South Africa instead had to preemptively use military force to force them to submit to Pretoria's regional hegemony, which was the exact same policy that Botha used when he was in power. Foster essentially wanted Pretoria to engage with Black Africa in a conversation about what it meant to be an African state and who had the right to form one. Botha was more like a nightclub bouncer. He wanted to regulate that conversation by forcibly ejecting anybody who disagreed with him. Of course, it was largely to placate the Hawks that Foster ended up intervening in the Angolan Civil War in 1975-76, which really turned out to be the turning point for the apartheid regime. The second critique of Foster's plan to re-ideologise what apartheid was advanced by the right wing of Foster's own party and was grounded in the racism that underpinned every aspect of white South African society, which dictated naturally sticking with the Rhodesian whites based on skin colour alone. They saw the Prime Minister's policies as appeasement and the thin edge of racial integration. But this critique resonated deeply with mainstream Afrikaner society. In October 1974, for example, just as Foster was getting his new ideas going, his recently retired Deputy Prime Minister launched a blistering attack in a speech in Kimberley, which you can see here. I think that we as white people must be under no illusions. The black military states, with their communist allies, have only one aim and object in view, and that is the surrender of the white man in South Africa. Those misguided people who believe that appeasement will satisfy them are living in a fool's paradise. I do not trust President Kaunda and have no faith in him. He is not and never will be, a friend of South Africa. I think this quote, the reason why I've reproduced it at length, is because it really sums up what most white South Africans felt as Foster went out and met with people like Kaunda. In the abstract, the white South African electorate was excited by the prospect of an end to all this isolation, denigration on the world stage, and of course the violence. If we look at the press from the time, Foster's meetings with black African leaders received rapturous coverage in the Afrikaans press. But in practice, the electorate was uncomfortable with the specific steps that Foster was outlining as being necessary to achieve these ends. And they were unconvinced that selling out Rhodesia's whites was ultimately prudent given the long legacy of bad relations with black Africans. Shortly before going to Victoria Falls, for example, Foster and Ian Smith went to a rugby game up at Loftusversfeld in Pretoria. When Foster's presence was announced by loudspeaker, the applause was warm. When Smith's presence was announced, the applause was rapturous. The grassroots racism trumped Foster's new idea. Now this resistance from within South African society to rapprochement with black Africa, whether for good reason, whether for anti-communist reasons, or just due to good old-fashioned racism, undermined Foster's confidence in his own policy. The Prime Minister ultimately was unwilling to take the steps that he needed to do to push Smith towards ceding power and making a settlement. That meeting that we had at the beginning in August 1975, the terms on which Kaunda, Smith, Foster and the Zimbabwean nationalists met that day were exactly the same that they'd agreed upon 8 months earlier at December 1974. In that entire time, Foster hadn't twisted Smith's arm to get them any closer to an actual settlement. And what this tells us is something that's absolutely fascinating, which is, ironically enough, Foster had indeed diminished the all-consuming focus on racial hierarchies in African leaders' perceptions of apartheid. Otherwise, Kaunda wouldn't have been there. But what he was unable and unwilling to do was actually effectively address or change the obsession with racial hierarchy within his own society, which leads to an obvious counterfactual. A better leader might have been able to do a better job. So to the third part of the talk, and the last one, the so what. Why are we here? Why do we care? It's Friday afternoon. How does this project connect with the bigger pictures in African decolonization and Cold War histories? I'd suggest that it offers us three big picture insights. First of all, it really reshapes our understanding of the relationship between the apartheid regime and black Africa. Instead of this habitual picture that we find almost impossible to escape, of a monolithic resistance to decolonization and African nationalism, this project shows a very different picture. It shows how the regime sought to use diplomatic successes in black Africa to drive an unlikely re-legitimization of apartheid as a system that was compatible with post-colonial. We'll learn something new about post-colonial Africa. In its quest for re-legitimization and international acceptance, South Africa was not just the focus of a big conversation in Africa, Asia, and Latin America about what it meant to be a global South, or specifically African state. It was a critical participant in that conversation. It had ideas. Its ideas resonated. Understanding why white South Africa engaged in that conversation and how it was able to displace apartheid from the center of discourses over legitimacy in the global South, I think, provides a lot of overdue nuance to a pretty stale picture of, if you'll allow, black versus white. Indeed, I think we can take this even further. Instead of seeing South Africa as the perennial exception in history, we need to also think about ways in which its experiences actually reflected those of other states in the global South. The post-colonial world of the 1970s was incredibly messy, in a state of flux. Throughout the developing world, this optimism of the 1960s, of the dawn of decolonization, of the new, brilliant societies that they were going to construct, had dissipated. Instead, there was a dramatic decline in political pluralism. There were oil shocks and a stuttering international economy. There was emerging multipolarity on the international stage. And of course, all those old colonial wars, like Algeria, that everybody thought were now a thing of the past, were, but they were replaced with new conflicts. Biafra to Bangladesh, Indonesia to Israel, South-on-South warfare. In this chaos, post-colonial leaders right across the global south were desperate for paradigms that could help them make sense of this very fluid, chaotic outside world, and for norms that could anchor their state's place in it. And I think much more interesting and meaningful insights are seen if we approach white South Africa as a polity dealing with these global dilemmas, rather than treating it as a unique entity, as part of the vast array of states searching for stability in this era, rather than apart from them. As this project shows, just like their critics, South African leaders were heavily preoccupied with the challenges of state building. How to build institutions that would operate in a post-colonial world. How to make themselves heard and respected on the world stage. How to reinforce ideologies that would enable them to govern effectively a racially, culturally, and ethnically fractured population. In this sense, South African leaders were comparable, for example, to Latin American juntas, articulating conservative state identities in an effort to exclude the burgeoning progressive political discourses. They shared something in common with American-sponsored conservative leaders right across the global south, from the Shah of Iran or Park Chung-hee in South Korea, seeking to legitimize systems of government that prioritized controlled, top-down development rather than bottom-up, broad-based political participation. Or, in fact, they were similar to black African leaders, searching desperately for intellectual tools, for ideas, for new patterns of relations, no matter how ridiculous, that might help them rule these unstable, artificial polities that they'd inherited from the colonial era. And what's even more interesting with this South Africa-Black Africa parallel is they not only had similar challenges, they experimented with similar types of solutions. Just as Foster was willing to trade in the international whiteness of settler societies for a more realpolitik approach for post-colonial survival by setting adrift the Rhodesians, so too were the anti-communist African leaders who spoke with him, similarly prepared to disaggregate the existing category of black or African for the sake of new paradigms of security and identity rooted in anti-communism. Second, I hope that's right. My research really underlines how the Cold War system, how important it was in shaping transfers of power in Southern Africa, and how it provided the apartheid regime with a new sense of legitimacy and a sense of purpose in the 1970s, once these old paradigms of top-down white racism are becoming passé. Again, in global perspective, white South Africa's experience in this regard is anything but unique. Anti-communism offered an ideological anchor for a regime in trouble, providing a language and a common paradigm through which the preservation of apartheid could be attached to wider global events and causes, in this case, the free world. Anti-communism assisted in the identification of the broad panoply of anti-apartheid discourses, movements, and people as nothing more than a function of communist power and ideas. Now, all of these processes had emerged slowly under Foster's predecessors, but it was during his tenure that South Africa's quest for survival, its national policy, if you like, came to be largely shaped by this one thing: the unique ways in which policymakers reconciled and interpreted the nexus between the Cold War on the one hand and their own apartheid doctrines on the other, and tried to work out how these two pieces of the jigsaw could be made to fit together. And of course, this applied not only to how Foster saw Africa, with his focus on dividing moderate states from radical ones, but obviously also to how Botha saw Africa, with his perception of African nationalism as little more than a tool of communist power. Finally, my research emphasizes, provocatively, the contingent and contested nature of decolonization in Southern Africa. And in this way, I think it really complicates our understanding of the demise of white rule. Recent work on French West Africa and British East Africa has emphasized that the victory of the nation state, the neo-European nation state, was in no way predetermined. African elites in the late 50s and early 60s developed a number of different political forms and identities and structures, but their societies were too weak because of the suddenness of decolonization to give them stable form. Southern Africa constituted another chapter in that story, not an entirely different book, as it so often seems. Could racial division, rather than integration, be accepted, whether through force or free will, by both black and white Africans as a workable political principle? Could Pretoria provide sufficient patronage through the homelands to co-opt black elites and marginalise radical calls for change? Could South Africa use its relations with black African leaders in Africa to show its international bona fides and therefore blunt calls for change at home? Today, standing here in 2014, the answers to these questions seem crystal clear, inevitable almost. But they weren't. They were exactly what was being fought over. Expanding our view across the global south from South Africa, Pretoria's ability to bring its visions to fruition was always strongest when it contributed substantially to favourable overarching African architectures. At the 1971 Addis Ababa Summit of the Organisation for African Unity, a body which of course was largely defined by the twin causes of opposition to white rule and Pan-African unity, no fewer than 6 African countries risked being seen as sellouts on both fronts by openly voting against a resolution that rejected engagement with Pretoria. 5 more countries abstained. These South African-sponsored redefinitions of what it meant to be a black African state and corrosions of the importance of anti-racialism in post-colonial identities created plenty of openings for the regime to strengthen its position, divide and complicate African opposition to apartheid, and increase its international acceptance. And until the cataclysmic invasion of Angola in 1975-76, which totally destroyed Foster's African outreach policy, Pretoria was surely in a reasonably strong position to take advantage of those openings and shape the future. And African expectations of what could realistically be achieved reflected that. And on that somber, dystopic note, I'd like to open the floor for questions.